Hello and welcome to the third in our series of videos with author Mark Cook about how he deciphered Linear A. Hello Mark.
Hi Jerry, thanks for having me again.
So Mark, what are we going to be discussing today?
Well Jerry, we're continuing to talk about the mechanics of Linear A and how it works in practice. And there's two things in particular that we're going to be discussing. First, we're going to finish what we were discussing last time, which was the mathematical proof that Linear A is shorthand Middle Egyptian written using hieroglyphs. And then secondly, we're actually going to translate an entire tablet from start to finish.
That's right. Last time we were talking about rams and wool being recorded in the ratio of 4:1.
Indeed, yeah. Back to rams and wool. If you remember last time, we were talking about tablet HT123A, and having identified the fact that items appear in the ratio of 4:1, we know, given that that same ratio appears in Linear B, that the items being recorded were rams and wool respectively. We showed last time from the maths how we know that the first item recorded means rams. This was represented by Linear A symbol L49, which was in turn a representation of hieroglyph F155. This, we showed, was the first hieroglyph in and represented the Middle Egyptian word web, meaning horned cattle. This was obviously used as a synonym for rams, and the symbol on the tablet thus had the meaning we predicted.
What then of the word for wool?
Well, we need to take a step back at this stage and think about the nature of archaeology and archaeological evidence. Say an archaeologist digs something out of the ground 1,000 years from now. Let's just say it's an old Coke can, and it is the only Coke can that has survived. From its archaeological context, perhaps denoted by a convenient coin nearby, the find can be dated to 2023. In this case, all the available evidence would indicate that maybe the first time that Coke was sold in cans was in 2023. Yet you could reasonably safely say that this was not the first Coke can produced. Common sense would tell you that. All you could say from the vantage point of 3023 was that Coke had been sold in cans for some time before 2023. How long before, though, you would not know. Now, in fact, as you and I know, because we have the records available to us, Coke has been sold in cans for some time.
Indeed.
The same principle applies with ancient languages. The use of all languages changes over time, and we rely on what survives to tell us of when these changes took place and when new words, say, came into use. In the case of Middle Egyptian, an ancient language, that evidence might be a tomb inscription, or it might be a papyrus that has survived. However, like the Coke can in the previous example, we can infer the use of new words first took place sometime before the date of the inscription or the date of the papyrus.
Fascinating stuff. Do we have any idea of how long before?
Well, over the last 20 years or so, analysis of the 1st and 2nd century AD Vindolanda tablets from near Hadrian's Wall has shown us the use of some Latin words that weren't known to have been used for over 1,000 years later, for the first time, but for these tablets, being recorded in use in the Middle Ages. So the period of time can be quite significant.
Wow.
I know, it's quite something. So as to Linear A and trying to identify the word for wool that was used, we have to cast the net a little wider than we might first have thought. And in fact, the Middle Egyptian word that was abbreviated in Linear A on tablet HT123A in particular was Shanu. and it was previously only known to have meant wall from 200 years later. As we will see later, the final hieroglyph in this word is used to represent something else in Linear A. In my book, I also discuss how a symbol based on the first hieroglyph is also used to represent another word. This leaves the hieroglyphs in the middle. Now, as we discussed last time, the form of shorthand used was that a word could be abbreviated to a symbol representing its first hieroglyph, or its last hieroglyph, or a distinctive hieroglyph from the middle of the word. Here, with the first and last hieroglyphs used, we are left with the hieroglyphs in the middle. So hieroglyphs X1, Z4 are rotated by 90 degrees. This is then simplified, and a single line of hieroglyph Z4 is moved inside the X1 semicircle, becoming Linear A symbol L90. This is the origin of the symbol that represents wall, and we see its use on tablet HT123A exactly where the accounting analysis we've undertaken said we would. As an aside, it is probably worth noting that we can use archaeological evidence to further confirm our findings at this point. Professor Ruth Palmer, a historian of the Mycenaeans, whose work I very much rate, notes that you would expect to find sheep recorded in the Linear A tablets found at Carnia. Of course, what is and is not shown on the Linear A tablets is always subject to the random nature of archaeological survival. That single Coke can that we previously talked about may not survive until 3023. So in the future, they may never know that people drank Coke and have been doing so for quite some time. Now, knowing the Linear A symbol that represents wool, we can see, in fact, that there are 3 instances where wool is recorded on the surviving Linear A tablets from Carnia. If there was wool, there must have been sheep. Therefore, now that the symbol for wool has been identified correctly, Professor Palmer's detailed understanding of the Cretan economy is shown to be correct. One other point to note here is that you can see that the scribe at Carnia has more diligently written the symbol with a slanted internal line rather than a horizontal one. So one of the things we have to deal with in deciphering an ancient language is, therefore, bad handwriting. Hopefully no one will try and decipher our language from any of my scribbles one day, because I don't think they'd get very far.
You should have been a doctor.
Maybe one day. Anyway, so that's it. 4-1, Ramsden Wall, the mathematical proof, and that's discussed in chapter 2 of my book, which is available for download. Now, on to deciphering an entire tablet.
Excellent.
So this is tablet HT21A. Now, when translating these tablets, because we are dealing with shorthand, we have to look for consistency in the translation within the tablet, as well as within the corpus as a whole to an extent. As we will see, this tablet records an inventory of animals and fodder, and these dominate the Linear A corpus. So starting with the categories of items recorded on this inventory, the first category is represented by Linear A symbol L42. This, it is relatively easy to see, is a representation of hieroglyph F27, the last hieroglyph in the word for goats. And we know that this is an animal because elsewhere in the Linear A corpus, this symbol appears with an equals symbol crossing the stem. And from Linear B, we know that this equals symbol crossing the stem means male. If something could be male, it was, therefore, an animal. Another point worth noting at this stage is that in Egyptian, lists were typically written with items described in the singular, and it is the singular iteration of the word that is abbreviated here. If you imagine in our language, the plural is indicated by adding an S to the end of the word. The ending of Egyptian words also change generically in the plural. Thus, if you were to abbreviate words to their last hieroglyph, as this ancient method of shorthand does, it would be the singular form where the identity and meaning of the word could more easily be identified that would be used. This symbol therefore means goats, with the word abbreviated to the final hieroglyph. It is followed by a count of 161. Skipping to the fourth category of items recorded, this symbol is a simplified version of hieroglyph F45. It represents the word for cow, idet, and again it is relatively straightforward to see how that linear A symbol L67 has been derived. Again, we know it is an animal because it appears elsewhere in the corpus with the male equals symbol crossing the stem. And there were a number of iterations of the word for cow, so which particular form was abbreviated here. The method of shorthand being used might mean that it is the first hieroglyph for certain iterations of the word that is being used to abbreviate it, or it might be the last hieroglyph and the symbol representing that is used to abbreviate it. Either way, this symbol means cows, and it's followed by a count of 7 plus a fraction. Now, we covered fractions last time, some of the simpler fractions, and this fraction has a value of a quarter. Now, why would the number of cows have a fraction value? And I think there are two possibilities. Either an animal had been slaughtered and part consumed and part remaining in store, or it may represent part ownership. We simply cannot tell. In the final category recorded on the tablet, as we have seen, this symbol represents the word meaning horned cattle, web. And indeed, as we have already seen on tablet HT123A, this is a synonym for rams. Indeed, given that we have grass, so cattle fodder, for male sheep recorded on the tablet, as we will see subsequently, we can also infer that rams are referred to here. This symbol is followed by a count of 1 plus a linear A fraction symbol, which has the value of minus a quarter. And this is discussed and determined in chapter 2 of my book, which I mentioned previously. Again, the fraction may represent at least one animal having been slaughtered and part consumed, or it may represent part ownership. So with these 3 animal groups now determined, we can look at the other 2 categories that we have skipped. So the second and third categories recorded on this tablet both start with the same symbol. It's linear A symbol L89, which is a rotated and reversed version of hieroglyph D3, which we briefly spoke about earlier. Here, it is used to represent the final hieroglyph in the word shenu, meaning grass or cattle fodder. Now, there are 2 categories of fodder, but 3 categories of animals. We might therefore suspect that at least one of the fodder types is for a collective noun of animals rather than specific animals that would encompass a number of species. And linear B assists us here again, as one of the collective nouns used in linear B for animals is quadrupeds. In the second category on the tablet, the symbol for fodder is joined to what looks like a cross in the sketch diagram, but is in fact more akin to a vertically mirrored capital letter L. Now, the Middle Egyptian word for quadrupeds is written beginning with hieroglyph D36, an arm. As we saw in our last video, hieroglyphs are frequently compressed horizontally so that they take up less room in linear A. So here, the arm is bent, and it is then rotated and then simplified to become the linear A symbol that represents it, this mirrored capital L. This is linear A symbol L2, but in the categorization of symbols in the linear A script, originally determined by Bryce in the 1960s, that symbol has the male equals symbol on it. Here the fodder is evidently for the female animals, that male equals symbol being absent, so it must be for the goats and the pigs, but not the rams. These joined symbols therefore mean grass, cattle fodder for the quadrupeds. They are followed by a count of 11. Next, looking at category 3, there are 3 hieroglyphs that are combined to make the linear A symbol shown. The first is the male equals symbol, which we know from linear B, and it is actually hieroglyph Z4 rotated by 90 degrees. And this is the last hieroglyph in the word for male, evidently as an abbreviation using the method of shorthand that we are for that word. It is then added to each arm of hieroglyph S29, the first hieroglyph in the word for sheep. So we have male sheep represented by what has become linear A symbol L44. This is then added to the linear A symbol representing hieroglyph D3, linear A symbol L89, and this was the final hieroglyph in the word for grass, cattle fodder. The 3 symbols together therefore mean grass, cattle fodder for the male sheep. This is the feed for the rams. This is then followed by a count of 3 plus a fraction value, which, as analysis sets out in my book, has a value of a quarter. So with the 5 categories of items on the tablet translated, we can now turn to the heading. In our last video, we looked at the Cretan place names that appear in the linear A corpus, and the correlation between those that appear in the linear B corpus. Here, if you remember, we see the city of Phaistos recorded. So we know where these animals and this fodder was located. And of course, where would you store such animals and livestock? Well, in a barn, of course, which guides us to our next word, meaning barn or storehouse. So the Middle Egyptian word for storehouse or barn is abbreviated to linear A symbol L74, representing that word's final hieroglyph, hieroglyph O1, by way of a simple rotation of that hieroglyph by 90 degrees. We can presume, given the numbers of animals in question and the fact that there was also fodder, that there was more than one of these storehouses or barns. This then leaves us with the final word to translate in the heading, the first letter on the tablet. Of course, If you count the animals and fodder in a barn for an inventory, it is the totals that you want counted. And this directs us to the final word that we need to find. Now here we have to look at a picture of the tablet rather than the sketch diagram to see some important nuances. The symbol has two distinct triangles with separate apexes. Now, as we have seen, certain linear A symbols are derived from the hieroglyph they represent by being horizontally compressed. So knowing that and expanding it out again, we get something similar to weighing scales, and that is linear A symbol L85. But in terms of the hieroglyph that it represents, this directs us to hieroglyph AA6, and that in turn was used synonymously in Egyptian with hieroglyph S23. And it just so happens that there is a word written using just this hieroglyph, or just this hieroglyph plus one other, that means total. So the first symbol on the tablet means total. Thus, the first four symbols of the tablet heading mean total in the storehouses at the city of Phaistos. And it is important to note that not only is this shorthand, but these are accounting records. So as with accounting records today, they are not normally written in grammatically correct language. So while in grammatically correct Egyptian, word order and endings are important, that is not the case in linear A. Now the tablet was found at Hagia Triada, apologies for the pronunciation, about 3 miles away. So that gives us something of an indication of the extent of the Hagia Triada temple's operations.
Fascinating stuff. So we know that the animals and fodder were recorded. We know that where they were recorded, but whose are they?
Well, that's our final symbol. And after the 4 symbols of the heading, there is one symbol in a subheading, separated by dots either side of it. Text breaks, if you like. If you remember, when we made our first video, I said that the tablets were the administrative records of Egyptian temples on Crete. Well, here we see that clearly. The symbol used here, linear A symbol L92, is clearly a simplified, rotated representation of hieroglyph V16. Here this symbol represents the last hieroglyph in the Egyptian word meaning file of priests, the body of priests on duty in an Egyptian temple. So this symbol, the subheading of the tablet, means for the file of priests. It was they whose animals and fodder were being counted here. Thus, translating the tablet in full, we have in the heading on row 1, total in the storehouses at the city of Phaistos. In the subheading, we have for the file of priests. In row 2, we have goats, 161, and we have grass, cattle fodder for the quadrupeds, 11. In row 3, we have grass, cattle fodder for the male sheep, 3 1/4, and we have cows, 7 1/4. And in the final row, we have horned cattle, which we know are rams, 3/4.
Wow, and there we have it.
Indeed, there we have it.
So what's next?
Well, there isn't much more that we can cover in these videos. Next, I hope people will take things further and download chapter 2 of my book, the link for which is beneath this video, and maybe even seek out the first edition. It's in libraries of record around the world. Beyond that, the publisher whose name I cannot mention, is working its way through the second edition of the book. So I hope to announce the publication of that soon. But for now, I hope people have enjoyed these videos that we prepared, Jerry, and hopefully inspired them a little bit.
That sounds exciting, and I wish you well with that. And that's that, the mechanics of Linear A and the deciphering of a tablet in its entirety. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.